Can you imagine you forget to pay your credit card bill so a banker shows up at your house and kidnaps your wife, your kid, and your dog? Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the world of the Bronze Age. This is a channel where I, a real-life lawyer, examine the laws of history. Today, we are talking about one of my all-time favorite topics, debt slavery in the Bronze Age. And from what I can tell, this is the first and the only video dedicated to this topic on all of YouTube, so we are in very exciting territory. The initial concept of debt slavery does not need any explaining. Just take, for example, this letter from the 3rd dynasty of Ur. Tell Ahu Kinnam that a wheel Amorum sends the following message. Immediately after you left for your trip, Imgerson arrived here and claimed, your husband owes me 1/3 of a mina of silver. He took your wife and daughter as pledges. Come back before your wife and daughter die from the work of constantly grinding barley while in detention. Please! Exclamation mark. Get your wife and daughter out of this. So this guy, Ahu Kinnam, goes on a business trip or he goes on vacation, and the second that he leaves, some guy who was hiding in a bush outside of his house pops out and says, hey, your husband owes me money, so now you, his wife, and your daughter are my debt slaves. The letter also voices very genuine concern that the wife and daughter will most likely die in captivity. This is not a very happy world that we're living in, but let's back up a little bit. So in order to get debt slavery, you logically need debt. And if I did a video on how the Bronze Age banking system worked, we would be here all day. So here's the long and short of it. This is a bartering economy. There was no paper money, there was no coinage. You were trading things for other things. Sometimes one of those things was precious metal. It was silver, like in this case. And the way that it worked is that when you took out a loan from somebody else, the loan would be inscribed on a debt note on a clay tablet, and the person to whom you owed the money, the creditor as we call it in the legal world, would have custody of your debt tablet. There was probably also another copy held in a bank or a temple or some other secure place for record-keeping purposes. In the event that you did not pay your debt, the holder of the debt note could kidnap you or your wife or your children or your slaves or your parakeet or whatever. They would hold on to it until the debt was repaid. How do we know this? Because we have another letter saying this. Tell Vagina, thus says Norzu, that when Lugal Pei has finished his work, he is to hand him over his debt tablet. This matter must not come up again. Who was as good as my brother? What's pretty cool about this topic is that we have letters from all stages of the debt slavery life cycle. So take a look at this one. Tell Halimu to give Aja Kala, the wife of Udana, as a pledge. So we have essentially a guy, our creditor, dispatching kidnappers. There's also one that goes like this. Tell Nabasa not to detain the wife of Dada just because there are not 4 rations on his account. So that's a letter calling off the kidnappers. And there's one that I think that's very funny. Tell Balulu to release the wife of Guzani. This matter must not come up again. So we're in a world where kidnapping people, their wives, and their children is a totally normal practice. It's almost as if the natural reaction to a non-payment of debt is to dispatch kidnappers. And it looks like these kidnappers were chomping at the bit based on these really hectic letters saying, no, please do not kidnap the nice people. Now, as far as the legality of kidnapping is concerned, there is no law saying that debt slavery is a prescribed remedy for non-payment of debt. It's condoned, it's tacitly acknowledged, but there's nothing saying like, no, this is what you do in the event that somebody doesn't pay you back. The first legal acknowledgement of debt slavery comes from the city of Eshnunna in a law code written by their leader, Dedusha, and he had a law code of about 60 laws, or at least 60 laws still exist. And his 22nd through 24th laws mention debt slavery. His 22nd law says this. If a man had nothing upon a man, but distrained the man's slave woman, the owner of the slave woman shall swear by the gods, thou hast nothing upon me, and silver as much as the price of the slave woman he shall weigh out. That's very confusing, and in English what that means is that if a man takes hostage your slave under false pretense, meaning that he lied about the debt or, fraud, then the fraudster would have to return the slave and also pay you the value of the slave. So you got your slave back and you also got the monetary value of the slave. How do you prove fraud? You don't have the debt note. So if they just kidnap your slave and they can't produce a copy of your debt note with your seal on it, chances are you would win. The Douche's 23rd law says that if a slave woman dies in the fraudulent captivity, then the fraudster would have to buy his victim 2 slaves to replace it. His 24th law says that if a man's wife is taken under the false pretense of debt and she dies, so she's kidnapped falsely and she dies, then the fraudster would be put to death. Now, weirdly, there's no law saying what happens if the wife is kidnapped under a false pretense and doesn't die. So let's just say that she's kidnapped and she's forced to grind barley like in the first letter. There's no punishment for it, and I'm not entirely sure why. When you examine laws, you have to ask yourself why they're being written. And in this case, in Eshnunna, it's pretty clear that you have a bunch of fraudsters running around kidnapping innocent people and using them as free slave labor. But it doesn't look like the issues were confined to just Eshnunna, because if you look at the first letter that I read from the 3rd dynasty of Ur, society had this widespread negative conception that debt slavery meant that your loved ones would be grinding barley until they died. The next legal acknowledgement that we have comes from Hammurabi's code a couple of decades after the laws of Eshnunna were written. And Hammurabi's code is notable because it focuses on both involuntary and voluntary servitude. As you will see, voluntary servitude, giving yourself up to pay a debt, is totally different than debt slavery. But first, let's talk about involuntary servitude. Hammurabi's 114th law reaffirms what the laws of Eshnunna had said, that if somebody makes a false claim of a debt and tries to resolve it through self-help via debt slavery, kidnapping, etc., he would owe his victim 1/3 of a mina of silver. Law 115 says that if a man takes a prisoner, someone who owes him money, and the prisoner dies a natural death, old age, illness, etc., that the debt would die with the prisoner and the matter would go no further. This is huge because it effectively ends inherited debt, meaning that, if your debt slave died, the creditor can no longer enslave the prisoner's survivors or anybody else to pay the debt. So let's say you kidnapped the wife dies a natural death, you then couldn't go and kidnap the daughter under the pretense that the debt wasn't paid. Very big deal. Hammurabi's 116th law addresses the opposite issue. What happens when the person taken as a debt slave dies of physical maltreatment or physical abuse? That is, they don't die of natural causes as contemplated in the 115th law. In that case, it says that the debtor could press the case to court. There are 2 possible paths you could take once you go to court, and the path is dependent on who the deceased debt slave is. So if the debt slave was a free person, meaning it was the debtor's wife or child, and the court finds that the creditor was guilty of physical abuse or maltreatment, in that case, the son of the creditor, assuming he had one, would be put to death. If it was a slave that was taken as a debt slave and was mistreated and died, then the creditor would owe the debtor 1/3 of a mina of gold, not silver, gold. This is one of the few mentions of gold that you have in all of Hammurabi's code. In both instances, no matter who died, whether it was a free person or one of your slaves that was then taken as a debt hostage, the debtor would get all of the money paid back. Now, I want to point out that Law 115, natural death, and Law 116, unnatural death, are saying 2 different things. Law 115 is saying that if your debt slave dies a natural death, the debt is paid. Law 116 says if your debt slave dies an unnatural death, the debt is extinguished. And that's important because that leaves open the possibility that the creditor is now going to owe the debtor money. It flips the equation on its head. Hammurabi's 117th law talks about voluntary servitude. Big difference. So far we've been talking about kidnappings and slavery, involuntary servitude. But you could also sell yourself, your wife, your children, or your slaves. And by sell, you're essentially giving yourself or those people up for rent for a certain period of time in satisfaction. If you did that, then Hammurabi's 117th law caps the debt sentence, the lease, at 3 years. If you were a free person. If you were a slave, then it's capped at 4 years. So that's a voluntary servitude. That's essentially a lease. Now, Hammurabi's 118th and 119th laws talk about actually selling slaves to pay for debts. And it's pretty interesting that when you're talking about selling people, like literally selling people, the law is absent of any mention of your wife or kids because I guess, culturally it was taboo to sell off your wife or children. So if you sold a slave, what the laws essentially say is that the person who purchased the slave could do whatever he wants with it, which makes sense because that's his property. But I think the point of it is that whoever sold the slave couldn't come back and say, actually, no, I meant to lease you the slave under Law 117. I didn't actually sell you. This says, no, you sold the slave. You could do whatever you want with it. But there is a caveat, and the caveat is Hammurabi's 119th law. It draws a distinction between regular slaves that are sold and slaves who have borne the debtor a child. So if the slave bore you a child and you sold it, legally it was treated as a lease. It's almost like pawning. So in that case, whoever purchased the slave couldn't just sell it and do whatever he wanted with it. All that the person who sold the slave would have to do, the original owner, is pay the money back, and then he would get his slave back, which is an interesting caveat. When I was working on this video, I couldn't help but ask myself, why the hell would people get married back then knowing that they could be used as collateral and taken as debt slaves? And I looked into it a little farther and I found something really cool. Apparently, the contracts of the Bronze Age world weren't just limited to copper ingots and wheat. No. They also had marriage contracts. So we are now detouring into Mesopotamian family law. We have evidence that a woman, upon marrying a man, could contract with him so that she could not be used as a debt slave to satisfy his debts. This comes around the same time as Hammurabi's code. Now, to be fair, we don't know exactly how the contract would work, whether she would pay him, was there consideration, would she put up a bond? We don't know. But it does make me wonder, and of course one question then leads to the other, how come all Mesopotamian women didn't have these marriage contracts? And my gut tells me there's one of two answers. Either one, the contracts were pretty much always ignored, or two, much like the modern prenuptial agreement, the prenup, most people want to assume that everything's going to be fine. No, we don't need a prenup. No, I don't need a contract saying that you can't take me as a debt slave. I trust you. Let's get married. Yeah. But I digress, as usual. Going back to the laws, it's very obvious that Hammurabi did go to great lengths to help streamline debt slavery and at least make it a little more just. But it doesn't look like his laws went a very long way of curing people's debt issues. How do we know this? Because his son and his immediate successor, Eshnunna, took the throne and immediately canceled all debts to the states. It looks like he may have left private debts intact because, you're a new king and you don't want to piss off all the people with the money. But the fact of the matter is, there still is a debt problem. But we do know that there were some Mesopotamian rulers who did cancel all debts, including private ones. Why? Misharum, mushroom, whatever it is. It's a funny word that has to do with the concept of balance. The idea of misharum is that you are returning things to equilibrium with nature, and that includes finances. And it was achieved primarily through issuing edicts or proclamations of kings, which, they're not law, but they have the force of law. It serves a political purpose as well. It stops your subjects from being hopelessly in debt, and stops wealth from being consolidated in the hands of only a few very powerful copper merchants. If you fast forward a few hundred years to the early Iron Age, you come to the Kingdom of Israel and the similar concept of the Jubilee. It's a celebration every 50 years that resulted in the return of all debt slaves, the return of property, and the cancellation of all debts. There are a couple of different theories on where the Jubilee came from, and we know that the first mention of a people called Israel comes from around 1200 BC, which puts you right smack dab in the middle of the Bronze Age. And in that context, it kind of jives with the overall Bronze Age Mesopotamian debt relief pattern, so it could make sense that it was derived from them. The issue with that is that we don't really know where the Jews were around that time because they were either in Egypt, they were wandering the desert under the leadership of Moses who got lost, they were fighting Philistines, or they were killing sea peoples on the Levantine coast. Nobody is really sure, and the second theory is that the Jubilee custom came about much later. We're talking about like 700 BC, either right before, during, or right after the Assyrians ended the Kingdom of Israel. Because of that, I'm going to talk about it when we get to the Jewish laws, the Mosaic laws, and we kind of hit the Iron Age. But I can talk about Egypt, where the Israelites were said to have originated or visited or were enslaved. I don't know. I've avoided talking about the Egyptians so far in this series of Bronze Age videos for good reason. The Egyptians didn't have any written laws, or at least none of their laws survived until today, which I find pretty hard to believe because they wrote it all in stone, and there's tons of other writings and inscriptions that we have. Why wouldn't we have laws? The prevailing theory is that they believed in divine will, so they didn't need laws because the gods were going to sort out all of their problems for them. There are like 5 laws and they're fragments. The translations aren't widely accessible, and because of that, I've shied away from covering the Egyptians because it's pretty much all speculation based on other people speculating. So take what I'm about to say with a grain of salt. If you run a quick Google search for, debt bondage or debt slavery in ancient Egypt, the AI prompts and the chat GPTs or whatever will say, yes, it was a thing. You, my loyal followers, are being lied to, or at the very least misled by the robots. There is no evidence that debt slavery was a thing in Bronze Age Egypt. We do know that debt slavery was a thing in Iron Age and Ptolemaic Egypt. Those came much later, and I think that's what these internet prompts are basing their conclusion off of. As far as actual academia is concerned, there are a handful of sparse letters from the Iron Age, where a man voluntarily sold himself to a few people, but it looks like it may have been for protection. There's no context of the letter, and more importantly, there's no evidence that it was to satisfy a debt. There are a handful of researchers and Egyptologists which use this letter that comes from the Iron Age to go way, way, way back into like the old kingdom in Egypt and say that this was a custom. There is just no evidence for it. There's a second letter from 800 BC, also the Iron Age, that involves a boy who was kept as collateral because his father failed to return his copper tools. This letter is also used as evidence that there was debt slavery in the Bronze Age. Again, it was not the Bronze Age, it was the Iron Age, and one of the books I read linked it to the first intermediate period in Egypt, which was 2000 BC, so it's like 1200 years before. It's sketchy. It's too far of a gap for me to try and justify. Now, there is one more punishment. So far, we've talked about involuntary servitude and voluntary servitude, but they also had jails. I don't have any law in any of the law codes saying that jails were like a government-run institution. It appears that maybe it was local, maybe it was private, but we do know that they had them because there's a letter from the 3rd dynasty of War saying that a couple of people are to remain in prison until the governor arrives. And there was only one letter saying that people could be thrown in jail because of debt, and it's a letter that I covered in another video, and it goes something like this. Speak to Iridan and Ili-Rabi. Why, oh why, have you not repaid Lu and Nana the mina of silver I owe him? I am being jailed because of this matter. Now, I can't tell whether this unnamed captive was being jailed informally, meaning like he was involuntarily detained, used as a debt slave, or whether he was in an literal actual jail. I'm inclined to think that physical jails were a possibility, but if anybody has any other details or any other context to share, please let me know in the comments. And that is it, ladies and gentlemen, for our video on debt slavery. Please pay your bills so that you could be spared the anguish of crushing barley until your untimely death. Thank you for watching, and be sure to tune in again to learn more about the laws of history.